single post?
No.
Why is that?
Because in a website like Gawker, Gawker.com specifically posts about 10,000 posts or articles in that year. The company posted 100,000 articles in that year. This particular post was obviously successful. It got 5 million page views, but in that year the company had about 7.3 billion page views. And so it's taking one small piece of a lot of activity and say, okay, that's the thing that made it successful. It's just real hard to assign a lot of value creation to just one individual activity.
Over the span of your 15-plus years in the internet media space, can you think of a single instance where the publication of one post materially affected a website's value?
I can't think of a specific case. I can't say it didn't happen, but I can't think of one.
When you look at valuing an internet media company, what information do you look at?
Well, increasingly, internet companies are valued very much like other businesses. So you tend to look at revenue, profits, and growth rate.
Revenue being how much money is coming into the company?
The top-line sales, and profit is sort of how much do you keep after you pay your bills, and growth rate is just how fast are revenue and profits growing.
And that's typical today?
Yes.
Where do you get that kind of information?
Well, there's the primary information, which is the company's own financials. And then more broadly, I look at what we call like market comparables, which would be investment banking reports and things like that.
Do you ever invest without looking at a company's actual financials?
No.
When you look at investing in an internet media company, do you look at their traffic?
That's one of the things you look at, sure.
In what capacity do you look at that?
Two ways. Traffic is like raw material. I guess I'd say it's like if I owned a mall, I need foot traffic. I need to walk through the mall, but the goal is actually to sell product. And so traffic creates the possibility of selling ads and making money. So I want to see how much do they have and what the quality of it is. Is it an audience that's otherwise attractive to advertisers?
So it sounds like it's necessary to have traffic, but that's not something you use.
Not the primary way to value the business. I want to see the result of the traffic. I want to see how the revenue grows.
So in the mall analogy, you have people in the mall. What are you looking at as far as valuations?
I'm sorry.
In your mall analogy, you have people coming into the mall. Ultimately, if you were going to value the mall, what do you look at?
The revenue per square foot, I think, in a real term. It's like, are the stores actually selling product?
The people coming through the doors, going up to the cash register and spending their money.
Yeah.
Over the past 15 years, have you ever heard, in any capacity, whether as a CEO, as a board member, a consultant, as an investor, have you heard of any transaction that you've personally been involved with over the course of that time, of a media company being principally valued based on unique visitors?
Not in the last 15 years. That was more common prior to that internet crash that I mentioned. But after that, I think people learned a hard lesson, which is, businesses pay bills with money, and that's what you keep track of.
And the internet crash being back in the
2000, 2001, 2002.
I want to just shift gears slightly. Earlier, you had mentioned that in being retained in this case, you looked to determine what benefit Gawker might have received financially. In doing that, did you try to determine the revenue that Gawker might have received from publishing the Hulk Hogan post?
Yes, I did.
At the time, in 2012, what was Gawker Media's primary source of revenue?
Advertising.
So, looking at advertising, what were the ways that the Hogan post could have actually made money for Gawker?
Primarily by driving extra traffic to the site that would have resulted in more ads being served.
And are there different ways that Gawker could have monetized that traffic?
The other revenue stream that they had at the time was commerce, and so at 90% of their business was advertising, The last 10% was commerce and other things.
Is that commerce portion driven by traffic?
Much less so.
Much less so than the display advertising?
Yes.
Why is that?
And again, the commerce side of the business tends to be more partnerships, product integration, sponsored like articles about products, but it's not as directly related. It's not a direct relationship to traffic increases.
So for your purposes, you look at the advertising revenue?
Principally, yes.
Okay, that Gawker derived from the Hogan.
Yes.
What are the possible sources of revenue through advertising that Gawker might have gotten from the Hogan Post?
So what I wanted to try to do was be as comprehensive as I could. And so I looked at 4 types of revenue. I looked at revenue, direct revenue on the actual page where folks came into. I looked at what I call session revenue, which is revenue from other pages on Gawker.com that they might have visited because they came into that first post. I looked at what I called network revenue. Gawker owns a bunch of different sites, and the question was, could somebody have come into Gawker.com and then gone off to Lifehacker, Gizmodo, Kotaku? Excuse me. Then the last thing I looked at is repeat revenue, which is, did folks come back to Gawker as a result of this, and did Gawker receive some long-term increase in traffic?
Some of this is a bit confusing. I want to just walk through each of those 4 things for a moment and make sure that we're all on the same page. The first thing I think you mentioned was direct revenue.
Yes, sir.
Explain again what direct revenue is.
So when any of us load a page on internet, the content we ask for comes up, but then there's also those kind of rectangular boxes that have ads in them, and they're display ads. And so the direct revenue is simply, I saw a link on, Huffington Post, clicked on it, came to the Hogan Post, and ads appeared on that. Might have appeared on that page, except in this particular case, there were no ads.
All right, so direct revenue is the ad impressions that are on the actual page that somebody's looking at.
Yes.
The second thing that you mentioned was, I think the phrase was session revenue?
Yes.
Explain again. Session revenue is what happens then after you leave that post.
Yes, because, if you own the website, you hope that somebody's going to come to your site to see that one article and say, oh, here's this other article that's pretty interesting. Let me click on that too. And so what I wanted to allow for is that folks that came into Gawker on that one post click through to other articles while they were there that first time.
And for this session revenue would be people who came to the Hogan post and then ventured onto another Gawker.com article.
Yes.
The next thing that you talked about was network revenue?
Network revenue.
For network revenue, I take it is different than session revenue.
Yes. Gawker owns 8 or 9 different sites. Lifehacker, Gizmodo, Jalopnik, Kotaku, IO9, things like that. And so one of the other places that somebody could have gone after they saw that first Hogan post is to another Gawker site. And so I wanted to, and on that site they would have seen ads. So I wanted to allow for the folks that traveled from that first post to other Gawker sites.
Okay, so the first step was ads on the page itself. The second was ads on Gawker.com if people went to second level on the same website. Now you're looking at the entire Gawker family of websites and what revenue might have been derived from that. The last thing I think you mentioned was the fourth thing was repeat revenue.
Yes.
What is that?
The question I had, as I was thinking about what are all the ways that Gawker might have benefited, was, Gawker had been around for 10 years, so it wasn't a new site. But would folks have discovered Gawker as a result of this particular story that wouldn't have ever seen it before? And then did Gawker receive some increase in traffic over time?
So this is kind of a repeat customer at a restaurant. You come once, you like the meal, you come again another time.
Yeah, it's like a sample. You receive a sample, you go, oh, that's pretty good. in this particular case is, gee, I didn't know about Gawker, so I saw it. Now it's one of my favorite websites. I come back all the time.
So, in all of this, are you missing any possible sources of revenue?
Nothing significant that I can think of, no.
Now, we're about to walk through your numbers and your analysis in each of these four areas. Is this an exact science?
No.
This isn't some sort of like autopsy where we know exactly what's happened here, right?
No, sir.
Reasonable rough estimate?
Yes.
Okay. Why don't we then walk through what you did for each of these steps?
Please.
Ted, would you mind bringing up the first slide? Now, the first thing you had mentioned was direct revenue, which was whether Gawker got any money in its pockets from the actual posted issue here.
Yes.
That's right.
Yes, that's correct. And there were no ads on the initial post. So there was nothing in the bucket that I called direct revenue.
Now, you know at this point that there were people, a lot of people, who came to this post, right?
Yes.
Do you know the number of unique visitors to this post?
And for the purpose of my analysis, I chose to use the number that the plaintiff side suggested, which was the 5.35 million. I might have argued that the valid number is 2.5 million, which is the number of folks who looked at the video, or even less, the 2 million U.S. visitors who looked at the video. But for the sake of simplicity, I used the larger 5 million number.
And so here, it sounds like you're giving the plaintiff the benefit of the doubt.
Because it's an imprecise science, whenever there was a chance, I used the plaintiff's number or gave them the benefit of the doubt.
And here, I take it 5.3 million unique visitors came to the page, saw this page, and your conclusion is there was no direct revenue.
No, because there were no ads served.
All right. So then, the second thing that you did, I think, is went from here to session revenue. So can we pull up the second one? Again, session revenue is people who went from the Hogan post and then traveled to other posts on Gawker.com.
Yes.
Can you... The session revenue number that we'll get to, again, this isn't some precise number, correct?
No, but it's relatively close.
Just at the sort of big picture level, what's the general formula that you use to determine session revenue?
Okay. So for an ad-supported business, there are these three things that matter. It's people, how many folks come through. It's how many pages of content do they look at with ads on them. And then what's the rate at which Gawker makes money on each of those pages. And so what I was trying to figure out is what are the right three numbers to multiply. So for the people, I started with the 5.35 million people that came to that page. And there were two groups that I needed to subtract out. One group was international visitors, because U.S. media companies don't make any money on international traffic. Like when you receive the contract from the ad agency, it says specifically U.S.-only visitors. Because if you think about it, if I'm Ford and I'm selling cars in the U.S., I don't really want to pay money to advertise that car to somebody in England. The second group are the folks that looked at, and by the way, on that one, that's another one where I sort of used a number that was a little more favorable to the plaintiff, because I used a 20% assumption for international traffic, which I got from Alexa. If I'd gone to Quantcast, they use a 30% international traffic number.
Why don't we stop there? There's a whole lot of information that we're being conveyed, and I want to just make sure that we're all together with this. The people number, and I guess this runs throughout. Is this data specific to the Hogan post?
No, this is to the first number was the 5.35, but this number is for Gawker as an entire site.
Okay. When you were looking at how to go through the steps that we're going to walk through, you mentioned, I think, Alexa?
Alexa.
What is Alexa?
There are 2 or 3 ways that an internet company can analyze its audience and traffic. Google Analytics is one. That's a service provided by Google. Quantcast is another one. That's a third-party service. And then Alexa is owned by Amazon.com. And for the purpose of this analysis, I used Alexa primarily, but I cross-checked it back against Quantcast and Google Analytics.
And the data that you were looking at for Alexa was general data about how people interact with these websites generally, right?
Yes.
That data was not available specifically on a post-by-post basis.
It was not.
Okay, so you're applying the general practices, the general data for Gawker.com and the other websites we're talking about, and applying it based on that general data, applying it to the Hogan post.
Yeah, it's the behavior of visitors to Gawker, to Gizmodo. Yes.
So we know from that data that typically when somebody goes to Gawker.com, this is how folks respond.
Yes.
Now, the first part of your analysis for session revenue was people, and I apologize for cutting you off. You started with this 5.3 million people went to the Hogan post.
Yes.
You're then trying to figure out how many people traveled on to another Gawker.com post.
Yes.
And the first thing I think that you started to mention, and I cut you off, was international visitors. And I think what you were saying was that with international folks, you took out why?
Because U.S. media sites cannot sell ads. The advertisers exclude international traffic from their ad buys in the contract. It says, no, don't serve ads to foreign visitors.
So you had mentioned Ford. When Ford comes to advertise on the U.S. site, what happens?
You get a contract from them, and it says, here are the terms under which you can serve ads. Here are the people we're aiming at. Here's the time frame. Here's the price. But one of the things it'll say is, but only U.S. traffic.
And so how did you determine what percentage of the traffic was international?
That's one of the things that all of the third-party traffic monitoring services keep track of.
And in general, what percentage of Gawker's traffic is international?
This is what I was starting to say earlier. There's a range of estimates between 20% and 30%, and that'll vary a little bit by month. And I went with 20%, which was the most conservative and plaintiff-friendly number in the range. Okay,
so you took the international folks out, and I think exactly where I cut you off there was explaining that you also took out another group of folks. Who was that?
Yes. So again, the number I'm trying to get to is the people who saw an ad on Gawker. So the second group I had to pull out were the folks who only looked at the first page that didn't have any ads and then left the site. They saw a link somewhere that said, Hogan sex tape, clicked on it, saw the article, said thank you, and hit their back button and went back to a search engine or to Huffington Post or Drudge Report, something like that.
Okay, so these are people who saw the post, read it, did whatever they wanted to do on it, and then just left Gawker entirely.
Yes.
In general, what percentage of Gawker's traffic ends up leaving after one hit?
55% plus or minus a couple of percent.
So over half of people who come to Gawker's website look at one post and just leave?
Yes.
The remaining people then do what?
Go on to other pages on Gawker.com that do carry advertising.
And roughly what percentage of people are there for that?
When you net everything out, it's about 35-36% of the folks that come in the front door wind up on other pages.
In Gawker?
In Gawker. U.S. individuals on other pages.
So at this point, what you've done here on the chart, it says you've gone from 5.3 million visitors of the Hogan page. There's then a number there that says 1.89 million?
Yes.
How are you getting that number?
That's basically just high school math, maybe grade school math. I took the top number, subtracted the international visitors, subtracted the folks that went back to wherever they came from on the first page, and I'm left with 1.9 million.
So estimated that 1.9 million continue from the Hogan post onto another Gawker.com article.
Yes, sir.
And what's the second line then? You said you look at people, pages. What's pages?
Okay, so again, on each page, Gawker has the potential to serve ads. And one of the other numbers that is tracked through the syndicated research is how many pages does the average person look at on that site. And so the average Gawker visitor looks at 2.37 pages. We know the first page did not have an ad on it, so the potential was for 1.37 pages that carried ads.
So when somebody comes typically to Gawker, they read one article, they might like it, they go to a second, some of those people go on to a third, but in general, people who wind up on the page look at 2.4
Yes.
pages. So, and then the last number there is revenue. What does that mean? Again, relatively simple math off a lot of zeros. Gawker had $22 million in ad revenue in 2012. They served 7.28 billion pages. I took the revenue and divided it by the number of pages and came up with about 0.3 cents of revenue for each page that was served. So this is looking at total revenue, how much could be attributed to any page view on Gawker.
Yes.
And at that point, when you divide that, you get 0.3 cents.
Yes.
So in general, that's how much money Gawker makes from each time that there's a page view.
Yes.
So then, how did you get the bottom line number for session revenue?
Yeah, that's back to just multiplication. I multiplied 1.89 times 1.37 times 0.3 cents.
So it's the number of people who went on to another Gawker.com article. They went on to, on average, 1.4 articles, and then for each of those articles, Gawker is deriving, on average, about 0.3 cents.
Yes, that's the math.
And what is the final?
$8,200.
Now, with this 0.3 cents, why is that number so low?
Probably a couple of reasons. So at this time, the average, and I'm going to mix two different words, and I'll apologize in advance. There's CPM, which is the price that a site charges for the individual ad. And then there's revenue per thousand, which is like every ad on that page, all the revenue divided by all the pages, which is the number I just gave you here, the 0.3 cents. The average CPM at this time was about $1.80, $1.90. Gawker probably sold, they tried to get $7 or $8, which was sort of best case, and on average they sold about half of their ads. So when you kind of add all of that up, this computes to a $3.16 revenue per thousand number, which to me seems quite reasonable.
So the idea being that if Gawker is selling bundles of ads in the thousand and charging $7+ for that, only half the pages or less have advertising at this.
Yes.
And so the average of somebody going onto a page, this is what the net result would be.
Yeah, it's like, I think about like an airplane. It's like it's got a seats, and it leaves the terminal. And the airline wants those seats filled, and they try to get as much for each seat as they can. But when the plane leaves the terminal, they're done. There's nobody in that seat. They don't get any revenue. Same thing with advertising.
Okay, so we looked at direct revenue, how much money Gawker got directly from the page. We looked at session revenue, people going off onto other Gawker.com sites. The next thing you mentioned was network revenue.
Yes.
So why don't we go to the next slide? And I think you explained network revenue is how many people went from the Hogan post onto other sites in the Gawker media family.
Yep.
How generally did you figure out this network revenue?
Yep. So I mentioned that 55 to 57% of the people that come to that first page just back right out and go somewhere else. What I was able to do through the syndicated research that I had is say, where do they go? A lot of those folks went to Facebook, or they went to Google, or they went to the New York Times. But some smaller percentage went to other sites within the Gawker family. And so what I wanted to do is say that if Gawker had received the benefit of that traffic as a result of this, to say, okay, where do they go within the Gawker family, and how much money might Gawker Media have made as a result of that?
So these are people look at the Hogan post and say, I want to go next to a Gizmodo article.
Yes.
I want to go next on to Jezebel.
Yeah. I saw an article about a cool new phone. I'll go over there.
And so on this, the first number on the slide says 2.383 million. What does that number represent?
That ties back to the earlier discussion. Those are the folks that, those are the 55% that left after reading the first article. And so what I wanted to say is, where do those folks go? And so what you see on the chart is that, 4.6% of the folks that leave Gawker.com go to Jezebel, 1.7% go to Kotaku, 4.5% go to Deadspin, 3.2% go to Gizmodo, and 2% go to IO9.
So we've looked at people who go from the Hogan Post to other Gawker.com articles. These are people who leave Gawker.com but wind up on these other sites.
Yes.
And how did you get those percentages?
Again, out of the research, the syndicated research that I used. And the reason I chose that Alexa specifically is it let me build this kind of flow to see where everybody had gone.
And again, this is just ballpark numbers. This is the standard average Gawker reader who comes to a post. This is what it shakes out.
Yes.
This isn't specific to the Hogan Post.
No, it is not.
But it's
But I notice I think it's not reflective of that as well.
Tim, can you please put up the next slide? So once you got those numbers, you then did what looks to be a very complicated set of math here for each of these sites.
Yep.
Before we look at that math, why is there no mention here of Jalopnik or Lifehacker?
Because the amount of traffic that was referred was under that 1.7% cutoff. It was like the amount of traffic was so small that I couldn't get a number for what it was.
But it'd be tiny compared to these other ones. All right. Could you just explain generally, maybe just looking at the Jezebel numbers up here, how you did an analysis from this point?
And I'll apologize in advance for the small type, but it's basically the same analysis that we did earlier. I'm trying to come back to figure out how many people went there, how many pages did they look at, and what revenue did Gawker derive as a result. So we saw in the earlier chart that 4.6% of the people that left Gawker.com went to Jezebel. So I apply that 4.6% to the 2.4 million people that were bouncing off of that first post, and that gave us 109,000 people who came to Jezebel from Gawker. I looked specifically at how many pages people looked at on average on each of those other sites. So in this particular case, in Jezebel, it was 2.28. So I multiplied the 109,000 people times the 2.28. And then I came back to that same number we saw earlier, which is the 0.3 cents, because that was across all of Gawker's properties, and came up with $790.
So basically, you went through the same steps for each of these websites that you had gone through with Gawker.com.
Yes.
And you know for each of these sites how many pages the average person who goes to those sites looks at.
Yes.
So again, like through Jezebel, you figured out how many people left Gawker.com, then went to Jezebel.
Yes.
And you know the average person who goes to Jezebel looks at 2.25 pages.
Yes.
And then you multiply that times the revenue Gawker is likely to derive.
Yes.
And for Jezebel, what does that get you?
With $780 for Jezebel.
And then you did the same analysis for Kotaku?
Kotaku.
And then what did that?
$288.
The same analysis for Deadspin?
$915.
And for Gizmodo? I'm sorry. For Gizmodo?
$472.
And for IO9?
$297.
And these numbers vary because less people in general go from Gawker.com to those websites.
Yes. And they looked at different amounts of content on each of those sites.
And when you add all of that up from the number of people who left Gawker.com seeing one post and wound up on these websites, how much revenue did Gawker Media get from that in total?
$2,762 in addition to the other session revenue that we saw.
So then the next thing that you looked at, I think, was repeat revenue.
Yes.
So we looked first at direct revenue, how much from the post, how much then went session revenue to Gawker.com. Now, network revenue, all the other Gawker media sites.
Yes.
Remind us, what's repeat revenue?
Repeat revenue was really just looking to the question of, did Gawker receive was there an inflection point, a change in the traffic pattern where the traffic increased after this post ran, and where I could say, oh yeah, here's an increase that's attributable to this article having run.
Okay, so why don't we pull up the last slide here, repeat revenue. So these are folks who see the Hogan Post and come back again and again to Gawker.
Yes.
What did you find looking at the data on Gawker.com about the effect of the Hogan Post?
That it was a spike. One of the things I tried to figure out was just the overall traffic pattern of Gawker. And Gawker is, in my opinion, I'll say it's a hits-driven business. Whenever there's a popular article, there's a spike in traffic, but the traffic erodes very, very quickly. And it's not building a series of steps. It's, there was, forgive me, an article in September that was popular about Kate Middleton's breasts, and there was a spike, and that dropped off. Then there was the Hulk Hogan sex tape article, which was popular, it dropped off. And then November wasn't a good month, a couple things going on, but then, including Hurricane Sandy, but then there was the I Am Adam Lanza's Mother article in December, and it picked up. But generally, the traffic pattern for Gawker from October of 12 into 13 was flat to down. There was no increase in traffic.
And so you had mentioned the term, I think, inflection point. What does that mean?
What you're looking for is a change in the behavior. It's like it's trending in a certain way, and suddenly there's a moment where, oh, geez, something different happened there. The slope of the traffic curve starts to go up and kind of stays going that way for a while. And I couldn't find any point here where the traffic actually, sort of trended up after this post ran.
All right, so just on the screen that you're looking at, these are Comcast numbers from the period from October 2011 through April 2013.
Yes.
This area here is May, June, July.
I'm sorry, Mr. Mayor, I can't see what you're...
Sorry, yeah, you don't have my pointer on your screen. The point where the slope is going up.
So if I could say, on the left-hand side, I'm not trying to do this without shouting into the microphone, that's into 2011. The first little gray blob at the bottom is like July of 2012, and then it goes up towards October of 12. And then it starts to drop very quickly afterwards.
And so this is October 2012. And what you're saying is that there's not an inflection point here because of...
No.
What would we see if there was an inflection point?
Actually, if the article had run earlier to the left-hand side of that graph, like down here in that trough, then we said, okay, something clearly happened there where the traffic ran up over a number of months. In this particular case, there wasn't a pattern like that.
In general, in your experience, when popular stories spike, do they lead to sustained long-term increases in traffic?
Not typically, no.
If there were a sustained increase in traffic, would you expect to see that on the chart? I think is what you're saying.
Yes.
So, looking at the Hogan Post, how much repeat revenue did you find?
I couldn't assign any repeat revenue because I didn't see any increase in traffic as a result of this over time.
Okay. In your analysis, did you assume that every visitor who visited the Hogan Post was a new visitor to Gawker.com?
Yes, I just took the traffic at face value. I didn't assume that some of those 5 million people had come the week before. I just took it all as new traffic.
Is it likely that everybody who came to the Hogan Post was a new Gawker.com reader?
No, I'm sure many of them had been there before. The site had been around for 10 years, had been successful for 10 years, so I'm sure many of them had been there before.
Why did you start from that assumption?
It just seemed like the cleanest and fairest way to think about it was to just assume they were all new, that none of them had been there before that post ran.
All right. Is it possible to put the four slides up there at the same time? All right. Well, just stepping back then, kind of going through each of these things, direct revenue you found $0.
Correct.
Session revenue, how much did you find?
$8,900.
$8,200?
$8,200, thank you.
In the network...
You're younger, your memory is better.
In network revenue...
$2,900.
And then for repeat revenue...
0.
And so all told, in your opinion, how much revenue did Gawker generate from the hotel?
Just about $11,000.
Did you reach that conclusion with a reasonable degree of certainty?
Yes. Yeah. And the other thing I did is I cross-checked it back to, the accounts called a smell test, is does this seem reasonable? And Gawker.com's revenue in the month of October of 12 was like $57,000. So even this being a successful post within that month, saying it was $8,000 something seemed reasonable.
But again, you're not saying that this is like exactly right.
No, but I guess I'd say if somebody wanted to argue that it should be $13,000 or $15,000, I'd say, yeah, I couldn't really argue that it's not $15,000. If they said it was $100,000, I'd say, boy, show your work, because that doesn't make any sense to me.
So big picture, looking at Gawker as a whole, would you say that one post could attribute a whole lot of revenue to the company?
Again, I think this post was about, call it $10,000, $11,000. And if you look at, again, this is a site that published 10 or 11,000 posts a year, a network that published 100,000 and did about $20 million in revenue. So, again, if I take a step back and say, okay, do these numbers seem reasonable in that context? To me, those numbers seem reasonable.
Thank you. I have no further questions.